everyone, I'm Kieran and welcome to Lesson 3 of Making Sense of Information Security. In this lesson, I'm going to look at the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR. The first thing to note is that GDPR is the law throughout the EU, including the UK. It's not optional, it's the law. In the UK, when or if EU law ceases to apply, we have the UK Data Protection Act of 2018, which for our purposes is GDPR under another name. So, what is GDPR? Let me just briefly mention what it is not. It's not a law about website privacy policies, and it's not focused on the question of consent to marketing communications. GDPR, in fact, is about upholding the rights of individuals, specifically the right to the protection of personal data in terms of how it is processed and stored, what it is used for, and how transparent and accurate this use is. So what is personal information? Well, it's any information that can be used to identify an individual. So a person's name is personal information, so is their email address and their telephone number, so in fact is the IP address of their computer. And in this context, what does it mean to process personal information? So to keep it simple, processing personal information means to store it, retrieve it, analyse it, or use it in any way in a computer system, or for that matter in a paper-based or other system. So when you add someone to a contact list, you are processing personal information. As you can gather then, GDPR applies to all companies. And some see it as a burden. But you can equally see it as a model piece of legislation, and you'll see a lot of other jurisdictions are starting to copy it now. Frankly, we're all a bit concerned these days about how companies use our information, and individuals do need protection. Why wouldn't you and your organisation champion this? Working in information security isn't just about telling people what they can't do, it's also about being one of the good guys. As I'm sure you know, there are 2 or 3 day courses on GDPR, but I'm going to try to get you to the essence of it in under 15 minutes, so I admit it, I won't quite cover everything. GDPR is not a rule book with which you might be in or out of compliance. And be just a little bit wary of people who talk about GDPR compliance. Right now, there's no such thing. There are no compliance frameworks for GDPR, though you may see them appear in the coming years. Instead, GDPR is a risk-based approach to information security. How you fulfill your responsibilities depends on the risks you face. We've talked a lot about risk already, and an understanding of risk is at the very heart of meeting your GDPR responsibilities. Let's look then at those responsibilities. So a lot of it is about documentation. To start, you need to find out and document all the personal information your company holds, including information about employees, suppliers, marketing prospects, everyone in fact. You might be surprised how much there is. Think, for example, of when somebody sends you in a CV on spec. That's personal information. Next, you need to figure out, and again document, what gives you the right to hold this information. This is known as the lawful basis. There are several. For us, the important ones are consent, legitimate interest, contractual requirements, and statutory or legal obligations. Now, you need to find out, and yes, of course, document, where this information is. Do you know where it's all stored? Can you find all of it? What about synchronized mobile devices? How about backups and archives? Consider now who else can access this information. Any suppliers? What about your IT support or cloud service provider? There must be written contracts and terms of service that acknowledge responsibilities in respect of the information. Now consider and carefully document any risks posed to the individuals concerned should you reveal this information to the wrong people, lose it, or if it's inaccurate. This is known as a privacy impact assessment, and it's very similar to a risk assessment, as we've already discussed. In this case, though, you're focused on risks to the data subjects, not risks to your company. But, just like with your own risk assessment, now you know the impact, you can set about risk mitigation and the identification of your responsibilities in the event of a breach. For example, you may be required to inform the individuals concerned, or the Information Commissioner's Office, or both. I keep repeating that you must document what you're doing, and this is because, unlike earlier data protection laws, GDPR requires that you're able to demonstrate that you're fulfilling your responsibilities. Documentation is the best way to do this. So, if you do as I suggest, you'll document the personal information you have, why you are storing it and what you are doing with it, on what legal basis you're entitled to do this, where you store it, how you protect it, who apart from your company has access to it and how they protect it, and what your responsibilities are and what you will do if, or perhaps when, something goes wrong. Let's return briefly to that question of lawful basis for processing information. Since GDPR came into effect in May 2018, it's been interesting to see the way attitudes have evolved. At first, as you probably remember, there was an obsession with consent. Remember all those emails that suggested that we can't talk to anyone, let alone market to them, unless we have their consent. And then people began to look at the idea of legitimate interest. And a lot of companies now use that as a catch-all basis for processing personal information. You must have a lawful basis for all forms of personal data. And you'll see legitimate interest used a lot for sales and marketing databases, and these might be just a list in a spreadsheet. But there's a catch. The thing is, if you're going to rely on legitimate interest, you have some quite specific responsibilities. You must carry out and document the three-part legitimate interest test, which runs as follows. First, identify the legitimate interest, and this can be your own commercial interest. Second, demonstrate that the way that you will process the information is necessary to your legitimate interest and that it can't be achieved in another way. Finally, balance your interest against the interests of the individual. Their legitimate interests always trump yours if you are doing anything that would cause them harm or they would not reasonably expect you to do. So, does this get you off the hook when it comes to your sales and marketing database? Well, yes and no. Yes, in that you do have a legitimate interest in selling your products or services, but no, because as we're going to see in the next lesson, GDPR is not the only legislation we need to consider here. Up to now, we have been talking about your responsibilities and those of your company or organisation. But remember, GDPR isn't all about you. In fact, it isn't about you at all. It is, as I mentioned, about protecting individual rights. And you, as the person responsible for GDPR, are the upholder of those rights. First of all, there are some rules about processing information. The information you process must be processed lawfully, fairly, transparently, and securely. It must be collected only for specific, explicit, and legitimate reasons, and not used for any other purpose. It must be adequate, relevant, and limited to your explicit purpose. It must be accurate and up to date, and it must only identify individuals for the explicit purpose, and only for as long as necessary for that purpose. As I mentioned, I can't quite cover everything in under 15 minutes, so I'm skipping here some important considerations if you process personally sensitive information, such as that relating to sexual, political, or religious preferences, health information, or information about minors. Neither am I covering the use of personal information for automated or algorithmic decision making, or the knotty question of transferring personal data out of the EU. Okay, and now to the question of rights. Individuals whose information you process have the right to know that you're processing their information, to have access to all the information you have about them, to require you to correct any inaccuracies in their information, to have you erase all the information you have about them, subject to your other obligations, to restrict what you can do with their information, to transfer their information to a different processor in a form that allows processing to continue, and finally to object to you processing their information. You will of course have spotted that it would be very hard to uphold those rights without going through the documentation steps that we've explored. Phew, it looks demanding, right? It's not as tough as it seems. I've unloaded a huge amount of information on you very quickly, so it does seem like a lot. But remember, information security is a journey, not an overnight big bang. And GDPR, as well as being a tough bit of legislation, really represents the state of the art in current security thinking. The way to tackle it, like anything else, is just to get started. And you've everything you need to do that in this lesson. Did you notice, by the way, we didn't even discuss website privacy policies? And the word consent didn't get much of a look in either. Think back to lesson 2 alongside this one if you're wondering where your website privacy policy fits in. And now it's your turn. Today's worksheet will get you started on identifying the personal information processed by your company and working out your lawful basis. So, thank you for watching, best of luck with the worksheet, and see you on lesson 4. Bye.